The Alpha King's son kicked and hit every woman, but kissed the new maid. The scream came from the east hall before the sun had even risen. Elira froze at the top of the staircase, her hand tight on the wooden railing, as a young maid ran past her with tears streaming down her face, clutching a broken tray of silver cups. Elira did not know her name yet. She had only arrived at the Alpha King's estate the night before, and already the walls seemed to whisper warnings she could not ignore. "Do not go near his study," an older maid named Wendy hissed, grabbing Elira's arm before she could take another step. "Not before noon. Not ever, if you can help it." "Whose study?" Elira asked, though somewhere deep inside her, she already knew the answer. "The prince," Wendy said, her voice dropping so low, it barely carried over the wind rattling the windows. "Kale. The Alpha King's son. He does not like being disturbed, and he does not forgive mistakes." Elira had heard stories about Kale long before she arrived at the estate looking for work. Every pack within 3 territories spoke his name with a mixture of fear and disbelief. He was said to be sharp-tongued, cold-blooded, and utterly without mercy toward the women who served in his father's house. Maids came and went like leaves in autumn, none of them lasting more than a few weeks under his temper. Some left the estate in tears. Others left without collecting their pay, too frightened to ever return. Elira had no pack of her own. Her parents had died when she was young, and the small settlement that once took her in had been swallowed by a rival territory years ago. She had wandered from town to town, taking whatever work she could find, sleeping in barns and empty stables more nights than she could count. When she heard the Alpha King's estate needed a new maid, she did not hesitate, even after hearing the warnings about his son. A roof over her head and food in her stomach mattered more than fear of a stranger's temper. She walked through the long marble corridor that morning, with her chin lifted, telling herself that whatever waited behind that study door could not be worse than the nights she had spent alone in the cold. She carried a stack of folded linens, freshly pressed, meant for the private quarters at the end of the hall. It was a simple task: deliver the linens, leave quietly, and return to the kitchen before the head housekeeper noticed she had wandered too far. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. As she rounded the corner near the private study, the door swung open with such force that it struck the wall behind it. Elira barely had time to step back before a tall figure stormed out, his dark hair disheveled, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though he might crack a tooth. His eyes, a deep and stormy shade of gray, locked onto her before she could retreat. "Who let you wander this far?" His voice was low, controlled, but carried an edge sharp enough to cut through steel. I was told to deliver linens to the private quarters," Elira answered, keeping her voice steady, despite the way her heart pounded against her ribs. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over her face, as though searching for a lie hidden somewhere in her expression. Elira did not look away. She had learned long ago that showing fear only invited more trouble, whether from wild animals in the forest or cruel men in grand houses. "You're new," he said finally. It was not a question. "Yes." "Then someone should have warned you to stay far from this hallway." "Someone did," Elira replied, surprising even herself with the steadiness in her voice. "I came anyway. I have a job to do." Something flickered across his face, confusion perhaps, or something closer to curiosity, before it vanished, behind the same cold mask he seemed to wear like armor. He said nothing more. He simply turned and walked away, his boots echoing down the corridor, until he disappeared around the far corner. Elira let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the linens in her arms, but she pressed forward, delivering them to the room, as instructed before hurrying back toward the kitchen. When she arrived, Wendy was waiting with wide eyes. "You saw him," she said. It was not a question either. "I did. And you are still standing here, unharmed." Elira nodded slowly, unsure herself why the encounter had ended so differently from what she expected. Every story she had heard painted Kale as a man who lashed out without hesitation, who could not stand the presence of women in his personal space. Yet he had only looked at her, spoken a handful of words, and walked away. "That does not happen," Wendy muttered, almost to herself. "That has never happened." The kitchen staff buzzed with quiet gossip for the rest of the morning. Elira tried to ignore it, focusing instead on scrubbing pots and folding fresh laundry, but she could feel the weight of curious glances following her every movement. She was the newest arrival, the outsider with no pack name attached to her, and now she had become something else entirely, the maid who had faced the prince and walked away without incident. By midday, the head housekeeper, a stern woman named Margaret, pulled Elira aside near the pantry. "I do not know what you did," Margaret said, "but do not mistake luck for safety. The prince's temper does not disappear, it only waits." "I did nothing unusual," Elira said honestly. "I only answered his questions." Margaret studied her for a long moment, the same way Cale had studied her in the hallway, searching for something hidden beneath the surface. "Perhaps that is exactly what unsettled him," she said finally. "No one else dares to speak so plainly in his presence." Elira did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing at all. She returned to her chores, grateful when the afternoon passed without further incident. She had heard enough stories that morning to understand the danger she had narrowly avoided, and she resolved to be more careful in the days ahead, avoiding the private study whenever possible. But as the sun began to set and the estate grew quiet, Elira found herself thinking about the brief flicker she had seen in Cale's eyes before he turned away. It was not the look of a man who enjoyed causing pain. It was something closer to exhaustion, as though he carried a weight far too heavy for anyone to see. She pushed the thought aside as she prepared for bed that night in the small quarters assigned to the estate's maids. She reminded herself that she had come here for work, not for sympathy toward a man everyone warned her to fear. Whatever pain lived behind his eyes was not her concern. Her only goal was to earn her keep, save what she could, and eventually find a place to call her own. Yet sleep did not come easily. Elira lay awake long after the other maids had drifted off, staring at the wooden beams above her narrow bed, replaying the moment in the hallway again and again. She told herself it meant nothing. A single conversation, brief and strange, could not undo months of warnings from strangers who clearly knew him far better than she did. Still, something about the encounter lingered in her mind like an unanswered question, refusing to fade no matter how firmly she tried to push it away. The following morning brought new tasks and new warnings. Margaret assigned Elira to the East Wing, far from the private study, insisting it would be safer for someone so new to the estate. Elira did not argue. She spent the day dusting shelves, polishing silver, and listening to the other maids share stories about Cale's past encounters with staff. Stories that grew more exaggerated with each retelling, though the fear behind them remained painfully real. One maid spoke of a woman dismissed without pay, after accidentally spilling tea near his desk. Another whispered about a cook who left the estate entirely after a single conversation with him, never explaining what had been said. The stories painted a portrait of a man, consumed by anger, someone who saw every woman around him as a threat or a burden, rather than a person deserving basic kindness. Elira listened carefully, storing each detail away, though she could not shake the memory of his expression in the hallway. It did not match the picture the others painted. There had been anger, yes, but beneath it lingered something quieter, something that looked almost like sorrow hidden behind a wall of practiced coldness. By evening, Elira found herself carrying a tray of tea toward the main sitting room, a task Margaret had assigned reluctantly after the usual maid fell ill. She walked slowly, careful not to spill a single drop, painfully aware that the sitting room sat only a short distance from Cale's private study. As she approached, she heard voices echoing from within. Cale's low, measured tone, mixed with the sharper, impatient voice of an older man she assumed to be the Alpha King himself. She hesitated outside the door, uncertain whether to knock or wait, when the conversation inside grew suddenly quiet. The door opened before she could decide, and Cale stepped out once again, his expression tighter than before, his shoulders tense with something Elira could not quite name. He stopped when he saw her standing there with the tray in her hands. "You again," he said, though there was no venom in his voice this time, only quiet surprise. "I was told to bring tea to the sitting room," Elira explained, holding the tray steady, despite the sudden nervous flutter in her chest. He studied her for a long moment, the same searching gaze from the day before returning to his eyes. Then, without another word, he stepped aside to let her pass, his gaze following her as she carried the tray into the room and set it carefully upon the table. When she turned to leave, she found him still standing near the doorway, watching her with an expression she could not fully understand, something between curiosity and quiet disbelief, as though he could not decide what to make of a woman who neither trembled nor fled in his presence. Neither of them spoke as she walked past him and back toward the kitchen, but Alira could feel his eyes following her long after she disappeared around the corner. She did not know what it meant, nor did she allow herself to dwell on it for long. Yet for the first time since arriving at the estate, she found herself wondering whether the stories she had been told painted only half a picture of the man everyone feared. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind rattle against the shutters, Alira could not stop thinking about the quiet moment between them, the silence that had felt less like tension and more like two strangers cautiously recognizing something unspoken in each other. She told herself it changed nothing. She had come to this estate for work, not for the complicated mystery of a man carrying wounds she could not yet see. But as sleep finally claimed her, she could not deny the small, stubborn curiosity taking root in her chest, refusing to let the matter rest. Word of the encounter spread through the estate, faster than Alira could have imagined. By the time she rose the next morning, the kitchen staff had already woven the story into something far larger than the simple exchange it had been. Some maids whispered that she had somehow tamed the prince with a single glance. Others insisted she had simply been lucky, and that her fortune would run out the moment she let her guard down. "You should be careful," said a young maid named Ophelia, setting down a basket of bread as Alira entered the kitchen. "Some of the others think you did something to charm him. That kind of talk can turn ugly quickly." "I did nothing," Alira said firmly. "I brought him tea and left. That is all." Ophelia gave her a sympathetic look, but said nothing more, though the wary glances from the older staff told Alira the matter would not be forgotten so easily. She spent the morning trying to blend into her usual routine, scrubbing floors and folding linens, hoping the gossip would fade if she gave it no further reason to grow. It did not take long, however, before Margaret summoned her again, this time with an assignment that made Alira's stomach tighten with unease. The Alpha King himself had requested that fresh water and clean towels be brought to the private study each morning, a task previously handled by a maid who had recently left the estate without explanation. Margaret hesitated before speaking the next part. "The king has asked specifically that you take over this duty," Margaret said, her voice carrying equal parts confusion and caution. "I do not know why, but it is not my place to question him." Alira's first instinct was to refuse, though she knew such a request from the Alpha King himself was not something a new maid could easily decline. She swallowed her nerves and nodded, accepting the assignment despite the uncertainty twisting in her chest. The following morning, she carried a tray of fresh water and folded towels toward the private study, her footsteps slower than usual as she approached the heavy wooden door. She knocked softly, unsure whether Cale would even be present, and waited for a response. "Enter," came his voice from within, low and steady. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, finding him seated behind a large desk, covered in scattered papers and open books. He did not look up immediately, allowing her a moment to set the tray down quietly near the edge of the desk. When she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "You are the one who did not run," he said, his gaze finally lifting to meet hers. "I did not see a reason to run," Alira replied carefully. "You spoke to me. You did not harm me." "Others have run for far less," he said, his tone unreadable. "Perhaps they had reasons I do not know," Alira said. "But I choose not to fear something before I understand it." His eyes narrowed slightly, studying her with the same intensity she remembered from their first encounter. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a held breath. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close enough that Alira nearly missed it. "You are either very brave or very foolish," he said finally. "Perhaps both," she answered, surprising herself with the boldness of her own response. He said nothing further, simply returning his attention to the papers scattered across his desk, though Alira noticed his shoulders had loosened slightly, the tension that seemed to permanently occupy his frame easing just a fraction. She took the moment as her cue to leave, quietly slipping out of the study and closing the door behind her. As the days passed, the morning ritual continued. Alira brought water and towels each day, and though their conversations remained brief, something subtle began to shift between them. Cale no longer greeted her with the same guarded hostility he showed to others. He asked small questions, where she had come from, what led her to seek work at the estate, and though she answered carefully, she found herself sharing more than she intended. She told him about the settlement she had lost as a child, about the years spent wandering without a pack to call her own. She did not share every detail, keeping certain wounds locked away as tightly as he seemed to keep his own. But the honesty between them grew steadily with each passing morning. One day, as she set down the tray, she noticed a heaviness in his expression that had not been there before. His eyes seemed distant, fixed on something far beyond the papers in front of him. "Is something troubling you?" she asked, before she could stop herself. He looked up, surprised by the question, as though no one had asked him something so simple in a very long time. "It is nothing you need concern yourself with," he said, though the words lacked their usual sharpness. "You do not have to tell me," Alira said gently, "but you do not have to carry it alone either." His eyes lingered on her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind them. He did not respond, but he did not dismiss her either, and she took that as enough for the day. She left the study quietly, her mind lingering on the brief flicker of vulnerability she had witnessed. Meanwhile, whispers among the staff grew louder. Some maids grew resentful, believing Alira had somehow gained favor through means they could not understand. A particular noblewoman named Vivian, who often visited the estate and made her interest in Kale well known, began asking pointed questions about the new maid who had captured his attention. "She is nothing more than a servant," Vivian said dismissively to another noblewoman during one of her visits, though her voice carried just far enough for the kitchen staff to overhear. "The prince simply tolerates her because she is new. It will not last." Alira heard the comment secondhand from Ophelia, who relayed it with visible concern. "Vivienne does not like competition," Ophelia warned. "Be careful. She has influence in this house that you do not." Alira nodded, though she reminded herself that whatever strange connection had formed between her and Kale was not something she sought or encouraged. She had come to the estate for honest work, not to entangle herself in the complicated politics of noble courtship and jealousy. Yet despite her caution, she could not deny the way her thoughts drifted toward their brief morning conversations, more often than she would like to admit. As the weeks progressed, Alira began noticing changes in Kale that others seemed to miss. He no longer snapped at the staff with the same frequency. His temper, once infamous throughout the estate, seemed to simmer rather than boil, at least when she was near. The other maids noticed too, though most attributed it to coincidence rather than anything meaningful. One evening, as Alira passed by the study later than usual, she heard raised voices from within, Kale's tone sharp, the Alpha King's voice equally firm. She hesitated near the door, uncertain whether to proceed, when she heard her own name mentioned amid the tension. "The maid has nothing to do with this," Kale's voice cut through the door, tight with restrained anger. "Leave her out of your plans." Alira's breath caught in her throat. She stepped back quietly, her heart pounding as she retreated down the hallway, unsure what to make of the conversation she had just overheard. Whatever plans the Alpha King had, it seemed she had unknowingly become part of them, though she could not begin to guess how or why. She returned to her quarters that night with far more questions than answers. The quiet curiosity she had carried since her first day at the estate, now tangled with a growing unease she could not shake. Whatever was happening within the walls of this grand house, she understood now that she was no longer simply an outside observer. She had become, whether she wanted it or not, a part of the story unfolding around her. The next morning arrived heavy with unspoken tension. Alira carried the usual tray toward the study, her steps slower than before, her mind still replaying the fragments of conversation she had overheard the night prior. She knocked softly, and when Kale's voice answered, it carried a rare note of exhaustion. She entered to find him standing near the window instead of seated at his desk, his back turned toward her, shoulders squared against some invisible weight. He did not turn immediately when she set the tray down. "You heard something last night," he said quietly, still facing the window. Alira hesitated, unsure whether to admit the truth or offer a careful denial. She chose honesty instead. "I heard my name," she said. "I did not mean to listen." He finally turned to face her, his expression unusually open, stripped of the guarded coldness she had grown accustomed to. "My father believes alliances are built through arrangements," he said. "He has ideas about my future that do not concern personal choice." "What kind of arrangements?" Alira asked carefully. Kale's jaw tightened. "Vivienne's family holds significant influence over the northern territories. My father believes a union between our houses would strengthen our position. He does not understand, or perhaps does not care, that some bonds cannot be forced." Elira remained silent, unsure how such information related to her, though a small, uncomfortable knot formed in her stomach at the mention of Vivian's name. "Why would my name come up in such a conversation?" she finally asked. Cale's gaze softened slightly as he studied her, though he did not immediately answer. "My father noticed the change in my temperament," he said eventually. He assumed a maid could not possibly be the reason for it, yet the timing was too obvious to ignore. "He warned me against distractions." The words settled heavily in the air between them. Elira did not know how to respond, torn between the flattery hidden within his admission and the unease of becoming entangled in matters far beyond her position. "I have caused you trouble," she said quietly. "You have caused me nothing but honesty," Cale replied, his voice low, "something I have not experienced from anyone in a very long time." Elira felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze, though she quickly reminded herself of the boundaries between them. A maid and a prince, separated by more than simple rank. She excused herself shortly after, leaving the study with her thoughts more tangled than ever. As the day progressed, Elira noticed Vivian's presence at the estate had grown more frequent, her visits accompanied by an entourage of attendants who seemed to watch the staff with calculating eyes. During one of her visits, Vivian cornered Elira near the linen closet, her expression polite on the surface but sharp beneath it. "You must be the maid everyone speaks of," Vivian said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "How fortunate for you, to catch the attention of someone so far above your station." "I only do my assigned duties," Elira replied evenly, refusing to be baited into confrontation. Vivian's smile tightened. "Duties can be reassigned," she said. "Perhaps it would be wiser for you to focus on tasks better suited to someone of your background." Elira held her ground, though she said nothing further, allowing Vivian to walk away, without granting her the satisfaction of a reaction. Still, the exchange left a lingering unease, a clear reminder that her presence at the estate had not gone unnoticed by those who saw her as an obstacle to their own ambitions. That evening, Margaret pulled Elira aside once more, her expression troubled. "Vivian has spoken to the king," she said quietly. "She believes your continued presence in the private study creates unnecessary complications." "I have done nothing improper," Elira said, her voice steady, despite the anxiety building beneath her calm exterior. "I know," Margaret replied gently, "but perception matters more than truth in a house like this. Be careful, Elira. Powerful people do not need real reasons to remove those they see as threats." Elira nodded, understanding the warning for what it was. She returned to her quarters that night with a heavy heart, uncertain how much longer her position at the estate would remain secure, regardless of how carefully she conducted herself. The following days brought increased scrutiny. Elira noticed the other staff watching her more closely, some with sympathy, others with poorly disguised suspicion. She continued her morning deliveries to the study, though she noticed Cale's demeanor had shifted once again, not toward coldness, but toward a quiet protectiveness she had not expected. "Ignore anything Vivian says to you," he told her one morning, his voice carrying an edge of quiet determination. "She holds no authority over your position here." "She has spoken to your father," Elira said carefully. "My father listens to many voices," Cale replied. "That does not mean he acts on all of them." Elira appreciated the reassurance, though she understood the precariousness of her situation remained unchanged. She was, after all, only a maid, while Vivian represented generational wealth and political influence that could shift the balance of power within the estate at any moment. Despite the growing tension, Elira found herself drawn deeper into the quiet moments she shared with Cale each morning. Their conversations grew longer, touching on subjects far beyond simple pleasantries. He spoke of his mother, a woman who had died when he was still young, her memory clearly one of the few gentle threads remaining in his otherwise guarded heart. Elira listened without judgment, offering quiet understanding rather than pity, something she suspected he had rarely received from those around him. In turn, she shared more of her own past, the loneliness of losing her settlement, the years of survival without a pack to call her own. Neither of them offered solutions or promises, only the simple comfort of being heard by someone who did not seek to use their vulnerability against them. One particular morning, as autumn winds rattled against the study windows, Cale set down his pen and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I do not understand why speaking with you feels different from everyone else," he admitted quietly. "You do not fear me. You do not flatter me. You simply exist as yourself, without pretense. Perhaps that is exactly why it feels different, Alira replied softly. Most people around you want something. I only want honesty. His expression softened further, something unspoken passing between them in the quiet stillness of the room. Neither moved to close the distance separating them, though the air between them felt charged with unspoken possibility. Alira eventually excused herself, her heart pounding with a mixture of confusion and quiet anticipation she had not felt in longer than she could remember. As she walked back toward the kitchen, she passed Vivian standing near the corridor, her eyes narrowed with unmistakable suspicion. Neither woman spoke, but the silent exchange between them carried a clear message. Whatever was growing between Alira and Kale had not gone unnoticed, and Vivian had no intention of allowing it to continue without a fight. Days later, the estate buzzed with preparations for an autumn gathering. The Alpha King had planned to strengthen ties with neighboring packs. Vivian's family had been invited as honored guests, and the entire staff scrambled to ready the grand hall for the occasion. Alira found herself assigned to assist with decorations, arranging candles and polishing silverware, alongside Ophelia, who chatted nervously about the importance of the evening. This gathering decides more than politics, Ophelia whispered as they worked. Everyone knows Vivian hopes to secure a formal announcement from the king regarding his son's future. Alira said nothing, focusing instead on the delicate task of folding napkins into careful shapes, though her thoughts drifted uneasily toward the conversation she had overheard weeks earlier. She reminded herself that whatever existed between her and Kale remained fragile and undefined, nothing that could withstand the weight of formal alliances and political ambition. That evening, as guests began arriving in elegant attire, Alira remained in the background, carrying trays of refreshments and refilling glasses as instructed. She caught brief glimpses of Kale across the grand hall, dressed formally, his expression carefully neutral as he greeted guests alongside his father. Vivian stood close beside him for much of the evening, her hand occasionally resting on his arm, in a display clearly meant for the watching crowd. Alira told herself the sight meant nothing, that such displays were simply part of the political theater expected of someone in his position, yet she could not deny the small ache that settled in her chest each time she witnessed it. Later in the evening, as the gathering moved toward its formal conclusion, the Alpha King rose to address the assembled guests. His voice boomed across the hall, commanding immediate silence. Tonight marks an important step toward strengthening the bonds between our territories, he announced. I am pleased to discuss a future alliance between my son and the Honorable Vivian's family. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some guests offering polite applause, others exchanging curious glances. Alira stood near the edge of the hall, her tray trembling slightly in her hands, as she watched Kale's expression tighten, his jaw clenched in the same manner she recognized from their earliest encounters. Father, Kale said, his voice carrying just enough authority to draw the room's attention. Such decisions require more than a single announcement made without my agreement. The Alpha King's expression darkened, though he maintained his composure before the assembled guests. We will discuss the details privately, he said firmly, though the tension between father and son was impossible to ignore. The gathering continued, despite the awkward exchange, though whispers spread quickly among the guests. Alira retreated toward the kitchen once the formal portion concluded, her mind racing with the implications of what she had witnessed. Whatever fragile connection had grown between her and Kale now stood shadowed beneath the weight of political expectation and his father's ambitions. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the estate settled into quiet exhaustion, Alira found herself summoned to the private study once more. Though the hour was unusually late, she hesitated outside the door, uncertain whether to knock, before finally gathering the courage to do so. Enter, Kale's voice answered, tired but steady. She stepped inside to find him seated behind his desk, his formal attire from the evening now disheveled, his expression heavy with unspoken frustration. I did not summon anyone, he said, looking up in mild surprise. Why have you come? I saw you leave the hall abruptly, Alira admitted. I wanted to make sure you were well. His expression softened slightly at her words, though exhaustion remained evident in the lines of his face. My father believes he can decide my future without my consent, he said quietly. He does not understand that some choices cannot be forced, regardless of political convenience. Alira remained silent, unsure how to respond to a matter so far removed from her own position within the estate. yet something in his expression compelled her to speak honestly. "What do you want?" she asked carefully. Kale's eyes lifted to meet hers, something raw and unguarded flickering behind them. "I want the freedom to choose for myself," he said, "something I have never truly been allowed." Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the silence between them carrying a weight neither seemed willing to break. Elira eventually excused herself, though she carried the conversation with her, long after she returned to her quarters, her thoughts tangled with questions she could not yet answer. The following days brought a noticeable shift in the estate's atmosphere. Vivienne's presence grew even more frequent, her demeanor toward Elira increasingly hostile beneath a thin veneer of polite indifference. Rumors began circulating among the staff that Vivienne had convinced the Alpha King to reduce Elira's responsibilities, citing concerns over appropriate conduct within the household. True to the rumors, Margaret approached Elira within the week, her expression apologetic yet firm. "The king has requested that your morning duties in the private study be reassigned," she said. "Effective immediately. Another maid will handle deliveries to Kale's quarters." Elira felt a heavy weight settle in her chest, though she nodded in quiet acceptance, understanding the political forces at play far exceeded her own influence within the household. "I understand," she said simply, though disappointment lingered beneath her calm exterior. She spent the following days assigned to distant corners of the estate, her contact with Kale reduced to occasional brief glimpses across hallways or gardens. Each time their eyes met, she noticed the same quiet frustration reflected in his expression, though neither dared to acknowledge it openly, given the watchful eyes surrounding them. One afternoon, while tending to the estate's garden as part of her newly reassigned duties, Elira noticed Kale approaching from a distance, his expression carefully neutral despite the tension she recognized beneath the surface. He stopped a respectful distance away, glancing briefly toward the nearby windows before speaking. "I did not agree to your reassignment," he said quietly. "My father acted without consulting me." "It is not my place to question his decisions," Elira replied carefully, though her voice carried a quiet sadness she could not fully disguise. "It is not fair," Kale said, his tone uncharacteristically vulnerable. "None of this is fair." Elira offered a small, understanding smile, though she said nothing further, aware of the risk such a conversation carried, if overheard by the wrong ears. Kale lingered a moment longer before turning away, his shoulders heavy with the same restrained frustration she had come to recognize as an integral part of who he was. That evening, as Elira prepared for bed, she overheard hushed conversation among the other maids, regarding an upcoming formal ceremony meant to solidify the alliance between Kale and Vivienne's family. The date had apparently been set for the following month, despite Kale's earlier objections during the autumn gathering. Elira lay awake long into the night, staring at the darkened ceiling above her narrow bed, torn between the practical reality of her position and the undeniable connection she had formed with a man she had no right to claim. She reminded herself repeatedly that whatever existed between them remained fragile, complicated, and ultimately overshadowed by forces far beyond either of their control. Yet despite every rational argument she offered herself, she could not deny the quiet ache that settled deeper into her heart with each passing day. News of the upcoming ceremony spread quickly through the estate, and with it came an atmosphere of forced celebration that Elira found increasingly difficult to endure. She threw herself into her reassigned duties, tending the gardens and assisting with laundry, hoping the physical labor would keep her thoughts from wandering toward matters she had no power to change. Despite her efforts, small moments continued to draw her and Kale together, as though fate refused to allow their connection to fade quietly into the background. One afternoon, while gathering herbs near the estate's outer wall, Elira spotted Kale sitting alone beneath a large oak tree, his posture uncharacteristically relaxed, a single book resting unopened in his lap. She hesitated, unsure whether to approach or continue her work undisturbed, but he noticed her before she could decide, waving her over with a small, tired smile. "You do not have to keep your distance," he said as she approached cautiously. "Not when no one else is watching." "I did not want to intrude," Elira replied, settling a respectful distance away. "You are never an intrusion," Kale said quietly, his eyes carrying a warmth she rarely witnessed elsewhere. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the autumn breeze rustling the leaves above them. Eventually, Kale spoke again, his voice softer than usual. "Do you ever wish for a different life?" he asked. One without the weight of expectation pressing down on every choice you make? Every day, Illyra admitted honestly, but wishing rarely changes reality. Sometimes it does, Cale said, glancing toward her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Sometimes, the right person changes everything. Illyra felt her cheeks warm at his words, though she quickly reminded herself of the ceremony looming on the horizon, the political alliance that threatened to pull him further from her reach with each passing day. You are betrothed to another, she said gently, though the words carried more sadness than she intended. I am promised to another, Cale corrected, his tone firm. There is a difference. Before Illyra could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their quiet exchange. Vivian appeared around the corner of the garden path, her expression sharpening the moment she noticed the two of them seated together beneath the oak tree. I see you have found new company, Vivian said coolly, her gaze flickering between Cale and Illyra with poorly concealed suspicion. I was simply resting, Cale replied evenly, rising to his feet without offering further explanation. Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly, though she said nothing more, instead extending her arm toward Cale with an expectant expression. He hesitated only briefly before accepting the gesture, allowing her to lead him back toward the main house, though he glanced once more toward Illyra before disappearing from view. Illyra remained seated beneath the oak tree, long after they departed, her chest tight with an emotion she struggled to name. She understood the impossibility of her situation clearly now, the walls separating her from any future, with Cale growing taller with each passing day. Yet the quiet words he had spoken continued to echo in her mind, refusing to fade no matter how firmly she tried to dismiss them. The following days brought increased pressure from Vivienne's camp, with subtle attempts to further diminish Illyra's standing within the estate. Small items went missing from her quarters, blamed quietly on her supposed carelessness. Whispered accusations regarding her conduct began circulating among the staff, though no one could produce actual evidence of wrongdoing. Margaret, though sympathetic, found herself increasingly unable to protect Illyra from the mounting political pressure. I fear matters will only grow more difficult as the ceremony approaches, she warned one evening. Vivienne's influence within this house grows stronger with each passing day. Illyra nodded, understanding the warning clearly, though she felt powerless to change the trajectory of events unfolding around her. She continued her assigned duties with quiet determination, refusing to give her detractors the satisfaction of witnessing her discouragement, even as the weight of uncertainty pressed heavily upon her. One evening, while delivering fresh linens to a guest chamber, Illyra overheard raised voices coming from a nearby sitting room. She recognized the Alpha King's firm tone mixed with Cale's restrained anger, the conversation clearly regarding the approaching ceremony. You will honor this arrangement, the Alpha King insisted. The alliance strengthens our position against the northern pacts. Personal feelings cannot outweigh the security of our people. You speak of security, while ignoring my own voice in the matter, Cale replied sharply. I have given years of loyalty to this house. I ask only for the freedom to choose my own future. Freedom is a luxury few in positions of power can afford, the Alpha King countered firmly. You will understand this responsibility in time, whether you accept it willingly or not. Illyra retreated quietly from the hallway, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had overheard. She understood now, more clearly than ever, the depth of the conflict Cale faced, torn between personal desire and the responsibilities placed upon him since birth. She could not help him navigate such matters, nor could she offer any solution beyond quiet understanding, yet she found herself wishing desperately that circumstances might somehow shift in their favor. Later that night, unable to sleep, Illyra wandered toward the quiet garden where she and Cale had shared their earlier conversation. She found him there again, seated beneath the same oak tree, his expression heavy with the same restrained frustration she had witnessed through the sitting room door. You heard, he said simply, without looking up as she approached. I did not mean to, Illyra replied honestly, settling beside him once more. It does not matter, Cale said quietly. The truth remains the same, regardless of who hears it. They sat together in silence for a long while, the weight of unspoken words settling comfortably between them, despite the uncertainty surrounding their future. Eventually, Cale turned to face her, his expression carrying a vulnerability she had rarely witnessed from him before. I do not want a life built on obligation, he admitted quietly. I want something real, even if it costs me everything my father believes I should value." Elira's heart pounded at his words, though she remained cautious, aware of the impossible distance separating their stations in life. "What are you saying?" she asked carefully. "I am saying that these quiet moments with you matter more to me than any ceremony my father arranges," Cale said, his voice steady, despite the risk carried within his admission. Neither of them moved to close the remaining distance between them, though the air grew thick with unspoken possibility. Elira eventually rose, her heart racing, unsure how to respond to such an admission given the political storm brewing around them. She bid him a quiet farewell and returned to her quarters, her thoughts consumed entirely by the conversation that had just unfolded beneath the autumn stars. In the days that followed, Elira found herself reflecting more deeply on the reasons behind Cale's guarded nature, piecing together fragments of his past from the careful words he had shared during their quiet conversations. She learned, through both his own admissions and the whispered accounts of longtime staff members, that his coldness toward women had not always defined him. Years earlier, before his mother's passing, Cale had been known throughout the estate as a warm and open young man, quick to laugh and generous with his time toward those around him. Everything changed after a woman named Celine entered his life, a noble woman whose affection, staff later discovered, had been carefully calculated to secure influence over the Alpha King's household, rather than genuine devotion toward Cale himself. Elira learned the details slowly, piecing together the story from an older maid named Constance, who had served the estate long enough to witness the transformation firsthand. Celine played her part well, Constance explained one quiet afternoon while folding laundry alongside Elira. She made him believe in something real, only to abandon him the moment a more advantageous alliance presented itself elsewhere. "What happened to him afterward?" Elira asked, though she suspected she already understood the answer. "He closed himself off," Constance said sadly. "The warmth everyone once knew disappeared, replaced by suspicion toward anyone who dared to get close. His mother's death shortly afterward only deepened his isolation. He built walls no one has managed to break through since." Elira absorbed this information carefully, understanding now the true weight behind the guarded coldness Cale displayed toward the world. His reputation for harsh words and dismissive behavior toward women, she realized, stemmed not from cruelty, but from a deep, unresolved wound that had never been given proper space to heal. Armed with this newfound understanding, Elira approached her interactions with Cale with even greater patience, careful never to press him toward vulnerability before he was ready to offer it willingly. Their conversations continued in quiet corners of the estate, whenever circumstances allowed, each exchange peeling back another careful layer of the walls he had built around himself. One afternoon, while helping tend to the estate's small orchard, Elira found Cale standing beneath the bare branches of an apple tree, his expression distant and troubled. She approached cautiously, sensing the weight of memory pressing upon him in that particular moment. "This was my mother's favorite place," he said quietly, without turning to acknowledge her arrival. "She used to bring me here as a child, teaching me the names of every plant within these walls." "She sounds like she was a wonderful woman," Elira said gently. "She was the only person who ever loved me without expecting something in return," Cale replied, his voice heavy with old grief. "After she passed, I convinced myself that kind of love did not exist beyond her. Celine only confirmed that belief." Elira remained silent, allowing him space to continue if he chose, though she offered no judgment or forced sympathy, understanding instinctively that such wounds required patience rather than pressure. Cale eventually turned to face her, his expression carrying a rare openness she had not witnessed before. "You remind me of her, in certain ways," he admitted quietly. "Not in appearance, but in the way you carry yourself. Honest, unafraid, without pretense." "I am simply myself," Elira replied softly. "Nothing more, nothing less." "That is precisely why it matters," Cale said, his voice barely above a whisper. The moment between them stretched delicately, neither willing to disturb the fragile openness that had finally emerged after weeks of careful, patient understanding. Elira felt her heart swell with a tenderness she had not expected to feel toward someone so thoroughly warned against. Yet she understood now that the man standing before her bore little resemblance to the cold, cruel figure painted by rumor and gossip throughout the estate. As the days progressed toward the approaching ceremony, Cale's demeanor toward the rest of the household began to shift subtly, though few besides Alira understood the reason behind the change. He grew more patient with the staff, offering rare words of gratitude where harsh criticism once dominated his interactions. Margaret noticed the difference first, remarking quietly to Alira one afternoon. "Whatever you have done," Margaret said, "it has changed him for the better. I have served this house many years, and I have never seen him carry himself with such quiet calm." Alira accepted the observation with humble uncertainty, unsure how much credit she truly deserved for changes rooted in wounds far deeper than anything she alone could heal. Yet she recognized, too, that patience and honest companionship had clearly begun mending fractures long left untreated within him. Despite this quiet progress, the looming ceremony continued, casting a heavy shadow over their growing connection. Vivian's presence at the estate remained constant, her determination to secure the alliance unwavering, despite Cale's clear reluctance. She grew increasingly suspicious of the change in his behavior, correctly suspecting that Alira's continued presence played a significant role in the transformation. One evening, Vivian confronted Alira directly outside the kitchen, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the frustration simmering beneath her polished exterior. "Whatever influence you believe you hold over him will not last," Vivian warned coldly. "The ceremony proceeds regardless of any foolish notions you may have allowed yourself to entertain." "I have no notions beyond honest kindness," Alira replied calmly, refusing to be provoked despite the tension crackling between them. "Kindness," Vivian repeated with a bitter laugh. "Do not mistake temporary curiosity for something lasting. Men like Cale require strength and status, not simple sentiment from a maid with nothing to offer." Alira held her ground, though the words stung more deeply than she wished to admit. She said nothing further, allowing Vivian to depart without granting her the satisfaction of a visible reaction, though the encounter left a lingering unease that followed her throughout the remainder of the evening. That night, as she prepared for bed, Alira found herself questioning the wisdom of allowing her feelings toward Cale to deepen any further, given the impossible barriers standing between them. Yet even as doubt crept into her thoughts, she could not deny the quiet certainty that whatever connection they shared carried a depth and honesty she had never before experienced, regardless of how impossible the circumstances surrounding it appeared. The night before the ceremony's final preparations were set to begin, a storm rolled over the estate, rattling windows and darkening the sky long before evening properly arrived. Alira had been sent to deliver extra blankets to the private quarters, as the temperature dropped sharply, and she found herself once again standing outside the door of Cale's study, hesitating before knocking. When she entered, she found him standing near the window, watching the storm with an expression of quiet turmoil. He did not turn immediately, though he acknowledged her presence with a small nod. "The ceremony details are finalized," he said, his voice hollow. "My father has scheduled the formal announcement for tomorrow evening." Alira set the blankets down carefully, her chest tightening at the news. "I am sorry," she said softly, unsure what else to offer. "I am not sorry for many things in my life," Cale said, turning to face her fully. "But I am sorry that circumstances have made it impossible for me to choose honestly." "You do not need to explain yourself to me," Alira said, though her voice wavered slightly. "I want to," Cale replied, taking a step closer. "For the first time in years, I want someone to understand exactly what I feel, without hiding behind walls or expectations." The storm outside intensified, thunder rolling faintly in the distance as rain lashed against the windows. Alira remained still, her heart pounding, as Cale closed the remaining distance between them, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hesitation. "I have spent years believing love only brings betrayal," he said quietly. "Yet every moment I have spent with you has shown me something different, something real." "Cale," Alira whispered, though she did not step away. "Tomorrow, everything changes," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever happens after tonight, I needed you to know the truth before it does." Before she could respond, he reached up gently, his fingers brushing lightly against her cheek. She did not pull away, her breath catching as he leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she chose. She did not. Their lips met in a soft, tender kiss, the storm outside fading into distant background noise as the moment between them unfolded with quiet, undeniable sincerity. When they finally parted, neither spoke for a long moment, both absorbing the weight of what had just occurred. Alira's hand rose instinctively to her own cheek, still warm from his touch, her mind racing with a mixture of joy and fear at the implications of what had just happened. "I should not have done that," Cale said quietly, though his expression carried no regret, only concern for the position it might place her in. "I do not regret it," Alira replied honestly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within her. "Tomorrow, I will be expected to stand before the entire estate and accept an arrangement I do not want," Cale said, his jaw tightening with renewed frustration. "I do not know how to reconcile that expectation with what I feel for you." "Perhaps you do not have to reconcile it tonight," Alira said gently. "Perhaps tonight can simply exist as its own moment, separate from tomorrow's uncertainty." Cale studied her for a long moment, something like gratitude flickering behind his eyes. "You have a way of making impossible situations feel bearable," he said softly. "I have simply learned that dwelling on what cannot be changed accomplishes nothing," Alira replied. "Better to hold on to the good moments while they exist." They remained together for a while longer, the storm gradually softening outside, as they spoke in hushed tones about matters both trivial and profound. Memories from childhood, hopes neither had dared voice aloud before, fears about the uncertain future stretching ahead of them. Eventually, practicality demanded Alira return to her quarters, before her prolonged absence drew unwanted attention, though she left the study that night, carrying a warmth she had not known in years. As she walked back through the quiet corridors, her thoughts remained consumed by the kiss they had shared, the tender vulnerability Cale had revealed, and the uncertain days that loomed ahead. She understood clearly that whatever fragile happiness she had discovered now stood threatened by forces far more powerful than either of them alone could overcome. Yet despite the fear building steadily within her chest, she could not bring herself to regret a single moment of the connection they had forged. She reached her quarters and settled into bed, though sleep remained elusive, as her mind replayed every detail of the evening. She thought of Vivienne's warnings, the Alpha King's political ambitions, and the ceremony scheduled to take place within hours. Despite the weight of uncertainty pressing upon her, she allowed herself, if only for that single night, to hold on to the quiet joy of knowing that Cale's feelings toward her were genuine, unshaken by rank, rumor, or the expectations of those who sought to control his future. Elsewhere within the estate, unbeknownst to either of them, a maid loyal to Vivienne had witnessed a portion of their exchange through a partially opened window, hurrying immediately to report what she had seen. The storm that night carried more than rain and thunder. It carried the first whispers of a confrontation neither Alira nor Cale could yet anticipate, one that would test the fragile bond they had only just discovered. Morning arrived with a strange stillness, the storm having passed, leaving the estate grounds soaked and glistening under pale sunlight. Alira rose early, her thoughts still lingering on the previous night's events, unaware that word of the encounter had already begun spreading through certain corners of the household. By mid-morning, Margaret approached her with a troubled expression, pulling her aside into a quiet corner near the pantry. "There are rumors circulating," Margaret said carefully, "regarding you and the prince. I do not know the full truth, but I fear whatever occurred last night has reached ears that will not treat the matter kindly." Alira's stomach tightened with dread. "What have you heard?" she asked. "Vivienne has requested an audience with the Alpha King this afternoon," Margaret said. "I believe she intends to present accusations regarding your conduct." Alira absorbed the warning with a steady breath, understanding the gravity of what awaited her. She had known, even in the quiet joy of the previous night, that consequences would eventually follow. She had simply hoped for more time before they arrived. The confrontation came sooner than expected. By early afternoon, Alira was summoned to the main hall, where the Alpha King sat upon his formal seat, flanked by advisors, and notably, Vivienne herself, her expression carrying a triumphant edge she made no effort to hide. "You stand accused of improper conduct with my son," the Alpha King said, his voice carrying the weight of formal authority. "Vivienne claims to have evidence of an inappropriate encounter within the private study last evening." Alira's heart pounded, though she forced herself to remain composed. "I delivered blankets as instructed," she said carefully. "Nothing more occurred that violated my duties." "A witness claims otherwise," Vivienne interjected smoothly, gesturing toward the maid who had reported the incident. The young woman stood nervously near the hall's entrance, avoiding Alira's gaze entirely. Before the Alpha King could press further, the sound of firm footsteps echoed through the hall as Kale entered, his expression thunderous despite his controlled posture. "Whatever occurred last night was of my own initiation," he said, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. "If blame must be assigned, it belongs to me alone." The Alpha King's gaze shifted sharply toward his son. "You admit to this encounter?" "I admit that I care for her," Kale said firmly, his eyes briefly meeting Alira's before returning to his father. "I admit that whatever exists between us is genuine, unlike the arrangement you seek to impose upon my future." Gasps rippled through the small gathering of advisors, though Vivian's expression twisted with barely restrained fury rather than shock. "This is precisely the distraction I warned you about," she said sharply, turning toward the Alpha King. "She has clearly manipulated him for her own gain." "I have manipulated no one," Alira said, finding her voice despite the intimidating scrutiny surrounding her. "I have only offered honesty, something perhaps unfamiliar within these walls." The Alpha King studied both his son and Alira for a long, tense moment, his expression unreadable. "This matter requires careful consideration," he said finally. "The ceremony will proceed as planned this evening. We will address the remaining questions afterward." Kale's jaw clenched at the announcement, though he said nothing further in the presence of the gathered advisors. Alira felt a heavy weight settle over her chest as she was dismissed from the hall, the uncertainty of what awaited her pressing down with unbearable intensity. She returned to her quarters in a daze, her thoughts spinning with fear over what consequences might follow such a public confrontation. Margaret found her there within the hour, her expression sympathetic yet grave. "You must be careful," Margaret warned. "Vivienne will not rest until she has secured what she believes is rightfully hers. And the king, regardless of his son's feelings, values political stability above personal happiness." "What do you suggest I do?" Alira asked, her voice trembling slightly, despite her efforts to remain composed. "I do not know," Margaret admitted honestly, "but whatever happens tonight will likely determine your future within this house." As evening approached, preparations for the ceremony continued throughout the estate, though the atmosphere carried a palpable tension, entirely different from the celebratory mood of previous events. Alira was assigned menial tasks, far removed from the main hall, effectively ensuring she would not be present to witness the formal proceedings. She worked quietly in the estate's laundry room as the ceremony began elsewhere, her heart aching with each passing hour, imagining Kale standing before the gathered guests, forced into an arrangement he clearly did not want. She told herself she had no right to interfere, no standing to challenge decisions made by those far above her station, yet the injustice of the situation gnawed at her with unrelenting persistence. Partway through the evening, Ophelia rushed into the laundry room, her expression a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "You must come quickly," she said breathlessly. "Something extraordinary is happening in the main hall." Alira's heart leapt with uncertain hope as she followed Ophelia through the quiet corridors, the sound of raised voices growing louder as they approached the grand hall. She hesitated near the entrance, uncertain whether to reveal her presence, when Kale's voice rang out clearly above the assembled crowd. "I will not participate in an arrangement built on obligation rather than genuine choice," he declared firmly, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "If this house values political convenience over honest happiness, then I question the very foundation upon which it stands." The Alpha King rose from his seat, his expression a mixture of anger and something that looked, surprisingly, like reluctant respect. "You would defy tradition, defy expectation, for the sake of a maid?" he asked, though his tone carried less hostility than Alira expected. "I would defy anything for the sake of genuine happiness," Kale replied without hesitation. "Something I have not known since before my mother's passing." The hall fell into stunned silence, the assembled guests exchanging uncertain glances, as Vivian's composure finally cracked entirely, her expression twisting with humiliation and fury. Alira remained hidden near the entrance, her heart pounding, as she watched the confrontation unfold, uncertain how the Alpha King would respond to his son's unprecedented defiance. The Alpha King remained silent for a long, tense moment, his eyes studying his son with an expression that shifted slowly from anger toward something more contemplative. The gathered guests waited in uneasy silence, none daring to speak, while the future of the estate's most significant alliance hung precariously in the balance. "You embarrass this house," the Alpha King finally said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. Generations of careful diplomacy, undone by a moment of youthful sentiment. Generations of careful diplomacy, built upon forced arrangements and hollow promises. Kale countered firmly. "I have watched you rule this house with strength, father, but strength without honesty is merely another form of weakness." The words seemed to strike something deep within the Alpha King, his expression flickering briefly with an emotion Elira could not quite identify, perhaps memory, perhaps regret. He glanced toward Vivian, whose composure had crumbled entirely beneath the weight of public humiliation, before returning his attention to his son. "You risk everything for a maid with no name, no pack, no standing among our people," the Alpha King said, though his tone had softened considerably. "I risk everything for honesty," Kale replied, "something I have not known since before Mother's passing. If that risk costs me your approval, then I accept the consequence." A long silence stretched through the hall, broken only by the soft crackling of candles lining the walls. Elira, still hidden near the entrance, felt tears threatening at the corner of her eyes, moved deeply by the conviction carried within Kale's words, though fear for what consequences might follow still gripped her tightly. Vivian, sensing the shifting tide of the room, made one final attempt to salvage her position. "This is madness," she said sharply, turning toward the assembled guests for support. "A prince cannot abandon duty for the sake of infatuation with a common servant." "Infatuation fades," Kale replied evenly, his gaze unwavering. "What I feel has only grown stronger with each passing day. That is not infatuation. That is something far more enduring." The Alpha King raised a hand, silencing further protest from Vivian before she could continue. He studied his son for a long moment, something shifting visibly behind his stern expression. "Your mother once told me that forced loyalty crumbles under pressure, while loyalty freely given withstands any storm," he said quietly, more to himself than to the room. "I dismissed her wisdom in my grief. Perhaps I was wrong to do so." Kale's expression softened with cautious hope at his father's words, though he remained silent, allowing the Alpha King space to reach his own conclusion. After a long, contemplative pause, the Alpha King addressed the hall once more. "The arrangement with Vivian's family is dissolved," he announced formally, ignoring the sharp intake of breath that rippled through the gathered guests. "Alliances built on genuine respect will serve this house far better than those built on obligation alone." Vivian's face drained of color, her earlier confidence replaced entirely by shocked humiliation. She said nothing further, instead turning sharply and departing the hall with her remaining attendants trailing behind her, her ambitions for the evening thoroughly unraveled. Elira, still standing near the entrance, felt her heart soar with disbelief and quiet joy at the unexpected turn of events, though she remained hesitant to reveal her presence amid the lingering tension within the hall. Kale, however, seemed to sense her nearby, his gaze scanning the entrance until it found her standing partially concealed in the shadows. "Come forward," he said gently, extending an invitation that carried none of the coldness he once displayed toward anyone daring to approach him. Elira hesitated only briefly before stepping into the hall, feeling the weight of every gathered gaze settling upon her. She approached slowly, her heart pounding, as she stood before the Alpha King himself, uncertain what judgment awaited her. The Alpha King studied her carefully, his expression unreadable for a long moment. "You are the maid responsible for this transformation in my son," he said finally, though his tone carried curiosity rather than hostility. "I have only offered honesty, Your Grace," Elira replied carefully, keeping her voice steady despite her nerves. "Nothing more." "Sometimes honesty is precisely what changes everything," the Alpha King said, a faint, reluctant smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He turned toward his son, studying him with an expression that carried both pride and lingering uncertainty. "You are certain of this choice?" "More certain than I have been of anything in years," Kale replied without hesitation, his eyes never leaving Elira's face. The Alpha King nodded slowly, accepting the conviction carried within his son's words. "Then let this house witness a different kind of alliance tonight," he said, addressing the gathered guests once more. "One built not upon political convenience, but upon genuine choice." The hall remained quiet for a moment longer, before scattered applause began, hesitant at first, then growing steadily, as guests absorbed the unprecedented turn of events. Illyra felt tears finally slipping free, as Cale crossed the remaining distance between them, taking her hand gently within his own. "I told you last night that everything would change today," he said softly, only for her ears. "I did not expect it to change for the better." "Neither did I," Illyra replied, laughing softly through her tears. As the guests slowly returned to quiet conversation, processing the remarkable shift that had occurred within the hall, Illyra understood that the most difficult battles still lay ahead. Trust within the estate would take time to rebuild, and Vivian's humiliation would likely breed resentment that could resurface in unforeseen ways. Yet for the first time since her arrival at the estate, Illyra allowed herself to believe that a future with Cale, however uncertain, remained genuinely possible. In the weeks that followed the ceremony's dramatic conclusion, the estate slowly adjusted to the new reality that had unfolded within its walls. Vivian and her family withdrew their presence entirely, retreating to their northern territories with wounded pride, though whispers suggested she would not easily abandon her ambitions elsewhere. Cale, freed from the weight of an unwanted arrangement, began a quiet transformation that extended far beyond his relationship with Illyra. He approached the estate staff with newfound patience, offering sincere apologies to those he had treated harshly during the darkest years following his mother's passing and Celine's betrayal. Many staff members remained cautious at first, unaccustomed to such gentleness from someone once known for his sharp temper, but his consistency over time slowly earned their genuine trust. "I cannot undo the pain I caused," he told Margaret one afternoon, standing humbly before her in the same hallway where countless maids had once fled from his anger. "But I can commit to being someone worthy of this house's respect moving forward." Margaret, though initially skeptical, found herself moved by his sincerity. "Actions speak louder than words, my prince," she said carefully, "but I have already witnessed the beginning of such actions. Continue along this path, and trust will follow naturally." Illyra, meanwhile, found her position within the estate transformed entirely. No longer merely a maid navigating dangerous political currents, she became someone the staff increasingly looked toward with respect, understanding the role she had played in restoring balance and genuine warmth to a household long shadowed by grief and calculated ambition. The Alpha King, too, underwent a quiet shift in perspective, spending more time observing the growing bond between his son and Illyra, with genuine curiosity rather than political calculation. One afternoon, he summoned Illyra to a private meeting, his expression carrying none of the stern authority she had witnessed during the ceremony. "I owe you an apology," he said, surprising her with the directness of his admission. "I allowed grief and political ambition to cloud my judgment for far too long, placing unfair burdens upon my son's future happiness." "You sought to protect your people, Your Grace," Illyra replied carefully. "That is not something requiring apology. Protection built upon forced alliances rarely lasts," the Alpha King said thoughtfully. "My son's mother taught me that lesson years ago, though I foolishly forgot it in the years following her passing. You have reminded me of its truth." Illyra remained humbly silent, unsure how to respond to such an admission from someone in his position, though she appreciated the sincerity carried within his words. The Alpha King studied her for a long moment before continuing. "I understand now why my son's demeanor changed so significantly since your arrival," he said. "You possess a rare quality, the ability to offer honesty without expectation of reward. That quality is precious, and I would be a fool to stand in the way of the happiness it has brought him." As months passed, the bond between Illyra and Cale continued deepening, weathering occasional challenges, as remaining skeptics within the pack slowly came to accept the unconventional match. Cale formally requested his father's blessing to claim Illyra as his intended mate, a request the Alpha King granted without hesitation, recognizing the genuine transformation that had occurred within his son since her arrival. The formal announcement, when it finally came, carried none of the forced celebration that had characterized the earlier ceremony with Vivian. Instead, genuine joy radiated throughout the estate, as staff and pack members alike gathered to witness the union between the once feared prince and the humble maid who had changed him entirely. Illyra stood before the assembled crowd that evening, dressed modestly yet elegantly, her heart full of a happiness she had never dared imagine possible during her early days of quiet fear and uncertainty within the estate's walls. Cale stood beside her, his expression carrying none of the coldness that once defined him, replaced entirely by warmth and quiet devotion. Many of you remember a different version of me. Cale addressed the gathered crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. A man consumed by anger and grief, someone who caused pain to those who deserved only kindness. I cannot undo that past, but I can promise a different future, one built upon the honesty and genuine care this remarkable woman has shown me since the day she arrived. Applause and murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd, staff members who had once feared his temper now offering genuine smiles as they witnessed the transformation firsthand. Margaret, standing near the front of the gathering, wiped away a proud tear as she watched the ceremony unfold. As the celebration continued into the evening, Elira found a quiet moment alone with Cale, near the same oak tree where their earliest meaningful conversations had taken place. The autumn leaves had long since fallen, replaced now by the fresh green buds of spring, symbolizing the new beginning they had both fought so hard to secure. "Do you remember how frightened everyone was when I first arrived?" Elira asked softly, leaning against him as they watched the stars emerge above the estate. "I remember being frightened myself," Cale admitted with a small laugh. "Frightened of feeling something genuine again, after believing for so long that such feelings only led to pain." "And now?" Elira asked, glancing up at him with quiet affection. "Now I understand that genuine love does not demand walls or protection," Cale replied, pulling her closer. "It simply asks for honesty, patience, and the courage to choose it, even when everything within you insists it might be safer to remain guarded." Elira smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as the celebration continued in the distance behind them. She thought back to the frightened, uncertain woman who had arrived at the estate with nothing but determination and a desperate need for stability, never imagining that her simple honesty would ultimately transform not only a broken prince, but an entire household shadowed by grief and fear. The Alpha King's estate, once known throughout the territories for the cold reputation of its heir, slowly became known instead as a place of genuine warmth and fairness, a transformation credited entirely to the quiet courage of a maid who refused to let fear dictate her choices. Cale, once feared by every woman who crossed his path, became instead a symbol of redemption, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal, given patience, honesty, and the willingness to choose love over the comfortable safety of isolation. Years later, staff members would still share the story with newcomers arriving at the estate, recounting the tale of the maid who dared to stay when everyone else fled, and the prince who learned, through her quiet strength, that vulnerability was not weakness, but the truest form of courage a person could offer another. Their story became a lasting reminder within the pack that genuine change remained possible for anyone willing to face their deepest fears, and that love, built upon honesty rather than obligation, held power enough to transform even the most broken hearts into something whole again.